Hi, Misha here, and this is the second part in the video about straight pulls, like I promised. And the first one we looked at straight pulls versus turn bolts and why kind of turn bolts ended up being the preferred style. In this one though, we're going to look at the different, or at least some of the different types of straight pull systems. They weren't all the same. And I've laid out just about as many as I could fit on the table, and I did my best to pick the short rifle or carbine versions when possible. Here we have one that may not be as familiar today, but was extremely common in gun shops about 10 to 20 years ago when these were being imported because they were extremely cheap. This is the Austrian Steyr M95, and this is the Stetson, the short rifle. There was a long rifle version, but many of those actually were cut down to short rifles. There's also a carbine, which is the exact same barrel length. This might be a carbine. Yeah, it is, because the difference are just the sling swivels. Side swivels, carbine. Bottom swivels, short rifle. Or sometimes they have both, and then, I don't know, they're gender confused or something. But this was designed by Mannlicher and used by the Austro-Hungarian forces during World War I and through World War II to some extent. Originally it was chambered for 8mm 8x50. Later these were upgraded to fire 8x56, which was a Spitzer round. Next we have one that is kind of a pretty unknown. This is the Winchester model 1895, often known as the Lee-Navy. This was designed by James Paris Lee of Enfield fame and was used briefly by the U.S. Navy around the time of the Spanish-American War. There's only the one size here, which is relatively long. This fires a very advanced, for the day, 6mm round. It also has a very interesting, very unique operating system. In a way, it's not even actually a true straight pull, but we'll get into that. Set it on kind of the side because it doesn't want to sit upright. Next up, we have the most famous straight pulls, the Swiss series. There's actually several variations, but I brought out one of each of the major ones. This is a K11 carbine. This uses the original Schmidt-Rubin system, firing 7.5 GP11. The original version would fire the GP90 round. And then of course the one that's really famous, the KE31, often called a Schmidt-Rubin, but actually this does not use the Schmidt-Rubin straight pull system, although it's extremely inspired by it. Whereas the original guns would come in long rifle and carbine, these were only produced as short rifles. Even though the overall length is the same as the carbine K11, actually the barrel is a couple of inches longer because the overall action is a couple of inches shorter. It's one of the major benefits and updates of this style. This is also chambered for GP11. And then finally, we have one that's pretty well known. This is the Canadian Ross. And this is the Ross Mark II, also known as the M1905. This was his second major pattern. There would also be the Ross Mark III, known as the M1910. Like the Enfield, this is chambered for .303. These are only made in 1 barrel length. And just in terms of the story, this is my favorite. It's a pretty cool gun. And in some ways the best and the worst of all of these. So, I think I need the bigger table. With that said, we'll move on. Figured we'll start with the Swiss guns because that's what everyone knows. The K11 does use the original system, but it has been modified. I'm getting this out in this hand. The original bolt is the same, but on the initial 1889, the lugs are in the back. They moved them to the front of the sleeve, so still in the middle of the bolt, but this piece here is a sleeve. And that gave so many benefits. Better lockup, more durability, able to go to the hotter GP11. But you see it is a big bolt. What basically happens, this piece in the middle rotates. This slides to rotate it, and the center piece essentially stays fixed. Extractor. Safety. And the reason I say that the K31 is not a real Schmidt-Rubin, so if you look at its bolt, you'll see pretty quickly it is a different. Same basic shape, sort of, but we don't have this front section. Basically, we end where the lugs are. And of course, this is now just a bar versus a tube. This is why the K31 has a shorter action, because we don't have this whole up front piece. It's also simpler, more reliable, and stronger, and cheaper. So all around a win for the Swiss. Boy, I really need a bigger table. The initial gun, and get it back together. Whoop. These use bolt hold open followers. These have the Bakelite charging handle, whereas the K31s have a metal handle. So if you're in a gun shop and are just very quickly trying to ID, that's a really easy way to tell straight up. Also the mag, while they both use 6-round mags, the K31s is very square, has a rounded bottom but kind of squared off otherwise, very even release. Whereas your earlier K11 types have this angled magazine here. It's also detachable, but a very different shape. So that's another pretty quick way if you're just glancing at them to tell them apart. The sights are pretty similar. The 1911 rifles can be more accurate, but that has more to do with the longer barrel and a lot more to do with the longer sight radius. Sometimes I think the older guns were made with just a slightly better degree of craftsmanship, a little more polishing on the metal, a little deeper, more lustrous bluing, maybe a little better trigger. Could just be age, but they were also made at a different time. And believe it or not, one of the driving factors for the K-31, as nice as we think of them today, was cost. These were designed to be better, but also cheaper. So they were made with a little more mass production in mind. The trigger is better in some ways and maybe not as nice in others. It just depends. But yeah, there are differences. This was initially adopted, the Schmidt-Rubin system, in 1889. And if you count the K-31, this system served Switzerland in frontline use all the way through the late 1950s, and then secondary and kind of competitions with the soldiers through the 70s, 80s, and so on. It was designed for a citizen army in Switzerland then, even today to some extent. They don't so much have a large standing army, but each soldier has his own rifle and takes it home and can purchase it after his service. It's a unique system. You can read all about it online. But that kind of explains why their rifles were built to such a high standard, but also they expected them to be well maintained by the individuals who were carrying them, meaning they can be sensitive to mud, dirt, muck, and other grime. They were designed mainly with accuracy in mind, not so much utmost dependability and reliability in adverse situations. Well, we will move on. So let's look at the Steyr Mannlicher 1895. This is here, although there were older versions. There was the 1888, and then there was a model 1890. They actually used a slightly different system, but I don't have them to show you because they were primarily black powder guns, not smokeless, and smokeless is where I'd become interested. So yeah, they worked on updating their straight pull just as Switzerland did. These were designed to be a little cheaper to produce and more durable in the muck, meaning the system may not be quite as smooth as the Schmidt-Rubin, but a lot of people think it's really gritty. That mostly comes from the fact that a lot of the guns in the country today are old and refurbished, and when they were refurbished, they weren't always properly fitted to their bolts, making them sticky. If you have one that's been properly cleaned of its cosmoline and the bolt fits well, it is pretty darn nice. Trigger is military. It's heavy, but also smooth. It's not gritty or jerky, so it's smooth but heavy, which is kind of what you want on a military gun. These feed from on-block clips or packets. They hold 5 rounds each. When expended, the clip itself drops out the bottom. Unlike with the Carcano, the clips that the Steyr uses are they're unidirectional. They can only go in one way. This was updated later with some other nations, again like Italy, but again, this was an earlier design. After the 1895, the action itself really did not change. They just had a few minor variations here and there, and then the update to the Spitzer cartridge. These did okay in the mud and the dirt of World War I, but not awesome. They're weaker than a turnbolt. Primary extraction had a lot to do with that. But still yet, because they were a little, bigger and bulkier parts compared to this with, say, a Swiss gun, they held up pretty well. They're not known for heavy parts breakages or anything. That's why a lot of them survive to this day, and even now you can still find them pretty affordably because of the not easy to find ammo that they fire. Although I think now that PPU is making 8mm Steyr, which is great. For years, all you could get was the surplus stuff. Not a whole lot more to say. The bolt system, I am not going to take out because sometimes the bolt likes to snap on you. It has the lugs at the front. I'll try to show you here. Pretty standard looking bolt otherwise. Comes out very easily. So sometimes getting it back in, it can be a pain. And anytime you try to do anything on camera, everything is 10 times the pain just to spite you. So that was kind of one deficiency. Getting them disassembled, reassembled could be a little tricky in the field. Interesting note, Switzerland did adopt a version of this as the 1893 cavalry carbine, which we've done a video on. So yeah, even Switzerland used it for a time. It was one of the early leaders in straight pulls, and I would say the Mannlicher action was superior to the initial Schmidt-Rubin action. Later Schmidt-Rubin actions in the K31 though, yeah, not so much. Well, what about this gun here? Now we've done a couple of full videos on it, so I'm not going to harp. This is just mostly to have it for completionist's sake. This was designed by Lee. He won the competition for trials. The idea was to have a flat shooting high velocity rifle for the US Navy to use and US Marines to use on board ships. It was smokeless powder. The problem they ran into was the 6mm round was kind of ahead of its time. It was so hot for the day that it was burning out barrels. At the time, they just could not make barrels strong enough and durable enough to take the heat. Keep in mind, this is long before chrome lining. If it'd come out a couple of years later, probably would have been a little more successful. It also had various issues you can read about or check out other videos. But why did I say it's not exactly a straight pull? Well, it has a crank here. You actually lift up, which as you see tilts it up, and then pulls back. And then you crank it down to lock it. Now what's interesting, it's locked. This has a lot of bizarre controls on it. One reason I don't bring this out a lot is essentially when you use it, you're forced to dry fire it. There's really no great way to decock it or check the chamber. It does have a nice trigger. It's a very interesting trigger on these. And then that unlocks it. You can lift it up. But as you see, it's an interesting system. For anyone who's into mechanics, man, it's a hoot. But unfortunately, the ammo is almost impossible to get parts, and they only made 20,000 or so of these. There were some civilian versions as well. Pretty much a flash in the pan. I think it was originally there just to make the Craig Jorgensen look effective and long-lived. But whereas the Craig fired an underpowered round, this fired an overpowered round. And they had problems with firing pins breaking, and then, of course the extractors they had issues with, and just the overall bizarre system. The reason it locks is for safety. They were worried about it coming open during firing, so there are reasons. Like the Mannlicher, it can feed from packets in blocks, but unlike the Mannlicher, it can be fed with single rounds, and also even if it's fed with a clip, the clip will just strip in and fall out immediately. It doesn't feed directly from it. The feeding system is pretty unique on it too. The whole damn gun is unique, frankly. Pretty cool, honestly. It's one gun I would never shoot in my collection, but I'm really thrilled to have. This came from a friend years ago when he retired. But yeah, for more on that, you can check out the video. So it's a straight pull, sort of. It's one of the few that almost blends the two designs. Well, with that said, we will move on. Told you this second part would be longer. And finally, to the Canadian Ross. As I said at the beginning, this is the Mark II, the 1905 and 303. And now that I moved one of the Swiss guns off the table, I have room for the other version, the Mark III, the 1910. These do have slightly different actions and are very different guns in other ways. This is also chambered for 303. Now this is not the story of Ross. That's definitely a 30-minute video in and of itself. You can check that out, or check out CN Arsenal's videos. There's lots of great little videos on the Ross's history. It's a great one though, especially if you like kooky Canadians and Scottishmen. This system is essentially the same as the Steyr Mannlicher, the bolt anyway. Obviously it's different shapes and things, but the way it rotates, the way the lugs interface, it's the same. Now, one thing, if anyone knows anything, you know, if you know one piece of info, I should say, about the Ross, it's that you can assemble the bolt incorrectly. Well, no, that's not this version here. That's not the Mark II. As far as I know, unless a fluke happens, there's no way to assemble this bolt incorrectly. This feed system is unique. You notice there's no mag hanging down. It does have a double column magazine, holds 5 rounds, and it has this what's controlled the Harris feed or controlled feed system. Essentially, there's spring pressure. You press this large lever down to let it off. You just dump your rounds in and then lift it up to put pressure back on. There was no facility for stripper clips with these or chargers, so you just dumped your rounds in. These rifles are known for having very smooth bolts, very nice triggers for a military gun especially. I mean, exceptionally nice. Very finely adjustable sights. Hooded front. And that's because in a lot of ways the Ross was designed initially as a sporting gun, not military gun. This was more or less hastily turned into a military rifle when Canada was denied permission to manufacture the Lee Enfield by the UK. So this being a design that was on hand, Sir Charles took advantage and did that. But again, it's kind of his take on a Mannlicher design. And these were used in World War I. But the Mark II, while it does have a nice bolt, a very nice trigger, very finely adjustable sights, and honestly is relatively svelte for a gun of that era, wasn't especially durable. More so than the Mark I, to be fair. But it just wasn't super durable, which led to the Mark III here. Quite a few changes. We have the same basic straight pull system, but you'll notice the bolt has these serrations there. That's because the lugs actually lock into recesses, almost screw in to interrupted threads in the receiver, much like an artillery piece. This was done to try to strengthen the action. Now this is the version that you could assemble incorrectly. However, it's not easy to assemble the bolt wrong, and it's actually very not easy to get the bolt back into the receiver wrong. So you kind of have to be an 18-year-old conscript. But that said, yes, military guns do need to be conscript proofed. To get around that, what they did, they installed a rivet here in the bolt sleeve to prevent incorrect reassembly. So it was an issue, but one that could be fixed. Other changes. We now have a single stack magazine. Still holds 5 rounds. You see it hangs down here. This does feed from stripper clips. We've moved the rear sight to the receiver bridge, giving a longer sight radius. It's still finely adjustable, but made a little bit bigger, more of a peep and such. We've gone to a heavier barrel, a more beefed up stock. And we have still a very nice trigger, but more of a military grade trigger. This, yeah, was honestly a version that was intentionally made from the get-go to be military. Although another purpose was, it's got a thicker receiver here. Ross had developed his own Magnum round, and he was really pushing everyone to try to using it. So this was designed to fire more powerful cartridges. To be fair, 303 is relatively weak. So it was all just around beefed up. To that end, it's actually a little bit longer and quite a bit heavier than the Mark II. Plus, again, the whole bolt thing. And while this was, in some ways, a better version, in some ways, it was not as good as the Mark II. In other ways, it still didn't fix all the issues. That's why the whole Canadian Ross series was relatively short-lived in its military career in World War I. But still a very iconic straight pull system derived from the Steyr Mannlicher. Again, this is just an overview comparison video. We have individual videos with more history and mechanics on all of these, so if you're interested, check those out. And these are not all the straight pulls that exist, for sure. But yeah, a couple of you have asked for us to do more CNR, milsurp type videos. They seem to be getting more popular on YouTube now, which is awesome. For years, you could not get people to view them at all, but I think because of Forgotten Weapons, CNR Arsenal, and other channels, they're starting to get more traction, which is great, because these are the guns that really got me into firearms as an adult. One thing, they were cheap, they were cool, they were historical, they were affordable, the ammo was affordable. So, yeah. Hope you enjoyed it. Again, we have a part 1, much shorter, if you want to check that out. If you have any questions or comments, please do post them below. And if you could, like, share, and subscribe, and check out the link to our Patreon page. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.